wanted to do a little addendum or response to some of the fair criticism from my Pickup Artistry MGTOW video, which really was about the relationship between capitalism, consumerism, and sexuality. So I wanted to look at this phenomenon of pickup artistry, of men going their own way, look at the female corollary, and ask, how is this a consumptive act? How does it benefit capitalism? People were responding in the comments saying, well, if it was all just about financial incentives and growing the market, then wouldn't capitalism want people to have children? Because the more people there are, the more consumption there is. People are buying diapers, people are buying baby clothes, people are buying kids' toys, people are buying all these things. And I don't think I really got to what I was trying to explain. Partially because I was trying to reformulate old audio in a new packaging. And really, my argument is not an economic argument. My argument is not that because of capitalism, because of the system, we have this morality as a result. Like that this, because a certain morality makes the most amount of money, then that's what capitalism gives us. And that's how some people think about it. They think in terms of like, well, if, porn makes a lot of money, then we're going to have a porn-approving culture, because whatever makes the most money is going to get social approval. Whereas whatever makes people poor, avow chastity, living in the mountains, things like that, that's not going to have social value attached to it. So that's kind of how a lot of economic thinkers are. They think, well, the economics are primary, and I get that. But that's not really the argument I wanted to present. At least I don't think that's the best argument that I can present, and maybe someday I'll completely scrap the video and redo it. But the argument I actually want to make is that there is a relationship between capitalism and the ideology of consumption, or the ideal of a consumer. That if people drop out of the capitalist system, if they stop consuming, then you're not going to have capitalism anymore. Now, a lot of people on the left have been saying this for a very long time. They've been saying we need to drop out, we need permaculture, we need sustainable farming, we need to go live in the woods. Recently, I guess a guy was shot in Mexico because there's an anarchist commune down in Mexico, and he got shot. And so, time and time again, these white people with dreadlocks pop up again, and these people basically argue that we need to drop out of capitalism. We need to stop consuming from this unethical market. We need to stop eating meat that is factory farmed. We need to stop eating GMO food. We need to stop doing all these things because they're not done in our best interest, but they're done in the interest of the profit motive. And the profit motive is a short-term motive. It's not sustainable. It really only looks at the profits to the company within the next 10, 20, 30 years. But when we look at intergenerational effects of, GMOs, and I don't really have a hard stance on GMOs, but there's certainly other things. Pesticides have been linked with degradation of the quality and quantity of sperm count. And then you're looking at various other chemicals that we use, plastics, BPA. All these things are used, and so the left, for a long time, the hard left, the extreme left, has been saying, hey, we need to drop out of the capitalist system. So certainly you can have kids and you can feed into the capitalist system, right? You can have kids and you can put them through public education and you can buy them all kinds of cheap Chinese plastic. Children can be quite consumptive indeed. And I also wanted to, in that video on pickup artistry and men going their own way and human sexuality, I wanted to highlight the relationship between women and consumption. And the fact that for women, an object, women are very subjective thinkers, whereas men can sometimes be too objective in the sense that they're more focused on objects rather than subjects, and so they're more focused on the fire than the arsonist. Women oftentimes are the opposite. Women don't care about objects in themselves, they only care about their subjective value. So a woman sees a car, a nice car, and there's no inherent value in the car to her. She's not getting the car because, you know, she has a job where there is a need for speed. You know, of course, it's not a practical thing. A sports car is not a practical thing. But the woman sees the nice sports car, and she's attracted to it because it tells her something about the owner, the subject. So the object of the car is not important. Really, she's using the car as a heuristic to gather information about the subject, the owner of the car. So she sees that car and she says, okay, so the subject, the owner, has a lot of money. Money is this abstract representation of power. So she says, well, if I get with this guy, if I marry this guy, if I court this guy, he can protect me. He can give me anything I want. He can give my offspring anything they want. So this is a guy that I should be interested in. And this is kind of the extreme version, I guess, is the gold digger phenomenon. But I wanted to highlight that as when you're engaging in pickup artistry and men going their own way to an extent, although that, you know, is kind of more, I think I want to focus on the pickup artistry for a moment. The pickup artistry, you're catering to the whims of women. And this is sort of how a lot of the capitalist economy is built, and something that the hard left doesn't want to recognize, is that a lot of the economy is built around the whims of women. And when we think about the housing market, our houses and the furniture we put inside them and the style and everything, is it built and is it catered to men or is it catered to women? There have been a lot of studies, a lot of research done into who shops and how they shop. And it used to be in America, when America was a very prosperous country, a very productive country, a very industrious country, a country with a strong work ethic. It used to be that the consumer market was much more geared toward men. Men were making a lot more of the purchasing decisions. Men would be the ones to buy the home. Men would be the ones with the final decision, final say in terms of who buys the car. Men would be the one who are making the decisions in terms of, you know, consumer goods, buying a microwave, buying an oven, whatever. After World War II, that starts to change. That now women become much more involved as consumers, spending sometimes the money of men, sometimes spending their own money. But there's a shift in advertising because there's a shift in the consumer base. And there's a shift in the economy away from producing, you know, steel, producing cars, producing tangible goods. And there's a shift away from that, shifting more toward a consumer economy, a service economy. And so the economy is no longer dedicated to building a car, building a house. I mean, that's still a significant portion of the economy. But there was a huge shift away from, you know, manufacturing steel, raw materials, toward manufacturing experiences, video games, television, entertainment, millions of dollars going into movies, millions of dollars going into creating vacations and resorts and spas and gyms, and women's workout areas, and all sorts of things dedicated to women. You look at the consumer habits of men, and of course men do spend money, and oftentimes the way they spend money is catered toward, in mind, I think subconsciously, unconsciously, sometimes consciously, but somewhere in the mind, in the front or the back of the mind, there is this concept of a man is buying the nice car so he can impress a woman. It's not that he likes the car in itself, although he might like the car in itself, but there's the additional benefit of implicitly, unconsciously, subconsciously, somehow He understands that this is a chick magnet. This is something that's going to theoretically, in an abstract way, gather the attention of women. Now, it might not practically serve that purpose. You know, you could think of a man on a desert island or something, still likes the hot rod, still likes the Mustang. He drives around on his deserted island and he feels cool. Because there's a simulacrum or a simulated reality somewhere in the recesses of his brain thinking that, in the eyes of women, I'm a cool guy. And the ultimate root of that desire to be a cool guy is the desire to reproduce with women, if you look at it from the viewpoint of evolutionary psychology. So I was just trying to detail how so much of the economy is orbiting around women. Women like expensive items, jewelry for example. They like them not because of their practical value or their practical virtue. They like them because they are a signal. They signal something about the man who gave them that thing. And sometimes they like to buy jewelry for themselves because it signals to men that, hey, I'm a high status woman, I'm a high maintenance woman, I'm a woman who likes nice things, and I'm looking for a superior man. So when a woman buys herself jewelry, she's kind of almost pretending that a man bought the jewelry for her. Again, subconscious thing, but when she displays that wealth, she's saying, I'm a wealthy woman, I'm suited for a wealthy man, that sort of thing. So when women buy things, they're buying things in this very consumptive way. It's not in a productive way. They're not buying raw steel in order to make, you know, some kind of great sculpture building, something like that. They're buying jewelry, they're buying cheap plastic stuff from China, they're buying cosmetics. They're spending thousands of dollars on cosmetics, thousands of dollars on clothing. They're spending all this stuff. And at the end of the day, it all goes back to sexuality. And for men, it's a very similar story. They're buying all this stuff. Why? So they can impress women. So my point here is that if we didn't have these men going their own way, if you had men and women that were bonded to one another within a family structure, then this rat race, this constant cycle of consumption would be slowed somewhat, because men would not be spending all of their hard-earned money trying to impress women because they would already have a wife. Now, subconsciously, unconsciously, whatever, you know, you could say, oh, well, there is a polyamorous aspect, or like people are not meant to be monogamous. Okay, so he might still try to be a cool guy. There still might be, obviously, adultery is a thing that happens. So he still might be consuming things, but the consumptive instinct will be dampened. And let's look at the corollary, or the opposite situation, where if someone does not have any kind of family structure, they don't have a reproductive social structure in their life, then what is the alternative? When people don't have a family, when they don't have children, oftentimes one of the ways they compensate for the emptiness is through consumption. So a childless man, he might, you know, in his midlife crisis, might buy the hot rod that makes him feel young again. A woman, she might, you know, pursue sex. She might pursue a career. She might pursue entertainment. And it can be quite sad. You know, there's this show, BoJack Horseman, something like that. And I look at it, I haven't even watched it, but I just look at it, and something about it to me is sad. Like, I look at the show, it makes me sad. It's a very melancholy, you know, this dark, this sarcastic humor. It's a very empty thing, and you start talking to people who are on the surface intelligent, successful, like a woman with a career, and, you know, you ask her, some of these atheistic women, you ask them, you know, what's your outlook on life? And it's like, well, I guess we're alone in the universe, and it's a terrible place, and I'm going to die alone. I mean, you start, if you really start to talk to people and you really listen, because people, there's a weird thing going on where people are always trying to impress others, but if you can get someone to the point where they're no longer trying to impress you, and you can just get them to open up, and you listen in a way that you show genuine interest in what's going on in their life, how they think of the world, and you start pulling out these very miserable, pathetic worldviews from people. Worldview is that, it's like, I guess in some senses you might encounter these and say, oh, well, this is an arbitrary sort of entropic worldview. This is the result of someone who's had no metaphysical education, no religious education, and they are just, this pessimism that they have, this nihilism that they have is sort of the state of nature. It's just the natural thing people default to. But upon further inspection, I have to wonder, could I even devise a more nefarious worldview? Could I even think of one? And it begins to become difficult when you think about how, again, people who on the surface are successful, happy, young, whatever, they have all the things that a normal person could expect to reasonably have. They have an above average privilege or whatever. And you start to look at this situation and you start to inquire, like, what is your outlook on the universe and what's your outlook on life? And they start giving you this black hole of emptiness. Well, everything happens for no good reason, and when we die, we go nowhere. And this is not like an uncommon opinion. And again, I look at it and I think, if I were to devise a worldview that was deliberately constructed in order to cause the spiritual suicide, not literal suicide, I'm not saying these people are killing themselves, although increasing numbers of them are, but a kind of spiritual suicide, if I was trying to destroy a people's spirit to make them feel alone, alienated, atomized, this conception, sometimes people will talk about, especially women will say things like, the universe is just so infinite, and we are nothing compared to it, and, so what's the point of anything? Again, these kind of thoughts, we've been instructed, we've been conditioned to believe that these sort of thoughts are just the natural default thoughts. That, without any kind of religious indoctrination, without any kind of religious brainwashing, some sort of optimistic, wishful thinking, we've been instructed to believe that, this is the default hypothesis, that the default position is just that the world's a terrible place, the universe is gigantic and scary and like Lovecraftian, like they conceive of the universe as this, like Cthulhu. They're nothing compared to Cthulhu, and it's a very depressing outlook. But yeah, I can't think of, if I was trying to, again, not trying to physically hurt people. Like if you told me, okay, here's a person, and your goal is to abuse them psychologically. You're not trying to physically hurt them. Don't touch them. Don't poison them. Don't do anything like that. Although, you can look at plastic as a form of poisoning, intergenerational through sperm quality. But okay, forgetting that for a moment, just psychologically, what would you teach them? How would you instruct them? How would you inform their view of the universe? And I would say, it's all just, everything's random. There's no higher pattern to everything. There's no higher harmony. Everything is just, it's like the universe is ruled by Cthulhu, and everything you do is insignificant. There's no meaninglessness. There's no meaning to anything, and it's all meaningless. And so you might as well just enjoy life and try to distract yourself with hedonism. And that was sort of my point about pickup artistry and men going their own way. It looks at the world system in the universe and says, this is corrupt, this is disgusting, everything's terrible. And therefore, I should try to fill my empty, meaningless existence with hedonistic pleasures. And so the pickup artists say, well, women are terrible, women are disgusting, women are just 3D PD, and therefore we're just going to try to sleep with as many as possible and just have as much casual sex as possible, and nothing really matters. And then the men going their own way say, yeah, everything is terrible, women are terrible, society's terrible, civilization is collapsing, and there's nothing we can do but enjoy the decline. And so they just say, you know what, don't even try to save civilization, don't vote for Trump, just enjoy the decline, just do whatever you can, in a very sociopathic way, do whatever you can to enjoy your life here on Earth. Go become an expatriate, go to a poor third world country, and spend your American dollars and live like a king and have an Asian, Filipino wife or whatever. And this is what they advocate. And my argument is that that is what capitalism wants. That's what capitalism wants. Capitalism wants to create this spiritual void, this spiritual vacuum within your soul. And so you notice all the time, you're just ever present. You have this constant anxiety and nervousness and depression. You notice this huge hole inside your heart. And so you're trying to fill it with all these consumer goods. Excuse me. People can do this whether they have children or they don't have children. So I made an argument saying that if people had families, if they had children, this would add meaning to their life and they would consume less. That's not necessarily the case. Some people, they can have children and they're just as consumptive, they're just as spiritually empty, they're just as unfulfilled. Now you ask, what is the alternative to this capitalist system? Well, the capitalist system, we have to recognize it's a merchant-led system. And so as long as you have a merchant-led system, they could call themselves capitalists, they could call themselves communists. But a communist society, capitalist society are both led by merchants. They're both led by materialists who think that they think of everything in terms of economics. Economics is primary and everything else is secondary. So, I think that's an appropriate, I often bring up that kind of viewpoint in terms of when I look at the history of revolutions. I think it's often appropriate to say that, material conditions, if people are starving in the streets, then they are willing to rethink things. They're willing to become revolutionary. If people are content, if they're comfortable, if they're living a bourgeoisie lifestyle, a little bit harder to do a revolution in that case. So, I think that's a legitimate perspective. Obviously, merchandising is a powerful thing. And understanding how advertising works and understanding how the merchant-led economy, understanding communism, it's not to say that this is all black magic and you shouldn't touch it and you should never learn about it. But it's to say that if you have a merchant-led society, whether it's capitalist, communist, socialist, something in between, you're always going to have this problem of spiritual emptiness because the merchant's never going to give you any kind of spirituality. And so you have to look outside of a merchant-led society. You have to look at warrior and priest-led societies. Now, the meaning in a warrior-led society is there's a couple of things. I have my video on the three paths, so to speak, where warriors are interested in aesthetics. Now, one way to look at the merchant class, in some ways, the priests and the warriors are a little bit more simple, but the merchant class kind of has, if you want to break it down into the most basic qualities and components, I describe the merchant class as its ultimate desire, its ultimate will is towards survival and hedonism. It sees money as the unit of survival, the unit of hedonism. It's something, this quantity that you can exchange in order to receive hedonism, to receive survival points in a way. But the warrior is also interested in survival. But the warrior is also interested in aesthetics. The warrior cannot be completely, cannot have an individualistic conception of survival. Whereas the merchant can have a concept of hoarding wealth, the warrior, a warrior cannot, or a warrior-led society cannot just be completely centered around the survival of the individual, because that's not how wars are fought. Wars are a collective action. And so for a merchant, the ultimate good is the enriching of the self. For a warrior, the ultimate good is the survival of the tribe, and that does require a level of self-sacrifice. And so things like honor are then ennobled, and teaching the youth, bringing up the youth, sustaining traditions, those sort of things are honored. Now, in a priest-led society, it's not about the survival of the individual. It's not even about the survival of the tribe per se, but it's more about harmonizing different levels of being. So the smallest level being, how do we harmonize the activities of life, objects, sacred objects? How do we, how do we integrate drugs into society or culture? How do we integrate different aspects of the life of the individual? Then how do we integrate the individual with the tribe? Then how do we integrate the tribe with the larger environment, the surroundings, neighboring tribes? And then how do we integrate a concept of humanity with animals at large or life at large? How do we then integrate or harmonize or create harmony between life at large and the natural world, the environment at large? So you can see this kind of onion-like harmonization process going on, where there's essentially an equivalence between the smallest thing in perception and the largest thing. The smallest thing being the smallest thing you can conceive of, the atom, I suppose, and then the universal. All of perception are brought into harmony, and they're made equivalent. The sand, the kernel of sand, becomes equivalent with the entire beach. There's a scene, I suppose, in I think it's not in The Matrix. It's in it's the one with the FBI and Will Smith and the aliens, and they go and they Orion's belt, and they have a little marble. And Men in Black, right? So Men in Black, I think it's Men in Black 2. And there's this little marble. And the marble, I think it's on the neck of a cat. And the marble contains a universe. And there's this alien who wants to come destroy the marble because he wants to destroy the universe. I don't know why he wants to destroy the universe. But there's a kind of, I'm trying to think of the name of the mathematical pattern. I guess fractals is the generic term. There's this sort of fractalation or fractalizing of this universe where within this marble is a universe, and within that universe there might be other marbles with other universes. This sort of infinite regression, turtles all the way down, is the ancient Greek conceptualization that the Earth, or perhaps it's of a Persian origin. Anyway, you have the Earth, and I guess it's on the back of an elephant. The elephant's on a turtle, and then the turtle's on infinite regression of turtles. So this concept of infinite regression, of equating the smallest instance or the simplest instance being the atom, literally the word, not the atom in terms of physics. The atom has further details. It has, protons and neutrons, electrons, and then we can look at those subatomic particles and say, oh, well, this is made of quarks, and no, actually it's string theory, and blah, 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 blah. No, it's a quantum mesh. So anything that you can break down into further details of perception is not the ideal of an atom. I'm using the term atom to mean essentially the simplest possible thing in perception. And for the Greeks, they thought of, I guess it was earth, air, fire, water, and then the fifth element being the quintessential element, quint meaning five. So the quintessence was sort of the spirit of things. And that those five together, and you have the Platonic forms, those were meant to be the simplest building blocks of reality that everything was built out of. So that idea of equating the simplest thing with the most complex thing, seeing the regression, seeing the patterns, harmonizing everything, you're trying to work out conflicts and resolve conflicts. And from the perception of the warrior, this doesn't necessarily make sense. This whole paradigm doesn't necessarily make sense, because for the warrior, everything's about struggle. For a warrior, everything's about our tribe versus their tribe. The merchant is not necessarily so combative. The merchant is not thinking it's me against the world necessarily, but the merchant is thinking, how can I gain relative power within this capitalist system? How can I sit myself on top of it and just collect rent from everybody else? But the priest is not thinking about necessarily the tribe or necessarily the individual, although these classes can be mixed. So you mix a priest with a merchant and you get sort of a Steve Jobs, or the Silicon Valley, the prophets of capitalism, or prophets of communism. So people who view economics with a kind of religious fervor. You could call it kind of a merger of the priest and the merchant class, so the commissar class. And then you have the merchant and the warrior become the mercenary. So someone who's obviously concerned with the body. They're a mercenary, they fight wars, but they're not doing so on behalf of a tribe or an ideal or honor. They're doing so on behalf of earning the living. And then you could have a merger. We had the priest and the merchant, the warrior and the merchant. Then you'd have the warrior and the priest. That would be something like a shaman, someone who is interested in harmonizing metaphysical objects, harmonizing subjects, mediation, but they're also in tune with the body, and so it's more of a focus on idolatry, and that's kind of where you get aesthetics, right? The worship of idols is sort of how you get aesthetics in the aesthetic tradition, the Western tradition. You know, I've made the argument that whereas the Hindus and the Brahmin, it's a priest-led society. The highest caste of that society is the ascetic caste, the caste that tries to achieve this internal harmony, this selflessness, so that it can lead society with perfect clarity. And then you have merchant-led societies of the Middle East, where trade, because it was this crossing point, the Mediterranean, Asia, Europe, Africa, the Middle East was really this trade center, this population center, trade center. You also get that in East Asia in the Yellow River Valley, where you just have a lot of people, and so merchants come along and they acquire all these resources, then they lead society. But my hypothesis has been that the Indo-Europeans, rather than being a priestly-led people or a merchant-led people, they were more sparsely populated, so they didn't have a huge merchant class, and then they were also didn't have this hugely developed priest class like in India, but instead they had this very highly developed warrior class, and that has influenced the other classes in society. So you know, the concept of being honorable in doing business, the Protestant work ethic, the concept of you know, a man who feels obligated not to cheat the person he's doing trade with. That's not a Middle Eastern concept. In the Middle East, it's like you try to get the best price you can get, because that's what the Neolithic population boom encouraged. It encouraged a lot of people who are good at cheating others out of money. It's how the power system worked. That's the incentive that was laid down in the cultural structure. But you know, in a case where if someone dishonors you, then you have to fight to the death. That kind of honor duel type society, especially Northern Europe, it didn't have the Neolithic population boom. It was still a Paleolithic culture for a very, very long time, didn't adopt farming for a very long time, held on to that warrior ethos. Now, how does the priestly class develop? I've kind of described why a warrior class might develop. The steppe, I just added a video to the playlist, the Really Makes You Think playlist. We've got, it's the old world island theory. And you look at the geography of the Indo-European steppe between Eastern China, or I should say between Western China and Ukraine, you have this area that's very much protected in the south by mountains, ranging from the Caucasus through the Persian Plateau or the Iranian Plateau, through the Hindu Kush, and up through the Gobi Desert. There's this in the Mongolian Plateau as well, there's sort of this protection, there's this isolation, and so the Neolithic farmers couldn't immigrate up into that area because it was too hard to cross over the mountains. It was a semi-permeable barrier. Maybe some of them did, but a lot of them chose to instead go south, take a southern route through to India or through the Mediterranean. They didn't choose to go up into that steppe 10,000 years ago during their initial population boom. And so that was sort of a protected, isolated area. And at the same time, there was this, it was more sparsely populated, and there was a huge movability, because once you get past that initial Caucasus mountain range, or this Persian Plateau, Iranian Plateau, the Hindu Kush, once you get past the Gobi Desert, you get into this internal Eurasian heartland. it's very easy to move around. It's all steppe. There's really no natural barriers between, say, Germany and the Altai Mountains. There's nothing really or the Urals. There's nothing really standing in your way. It's this basin, so you can just run around with your horses and your chariots and your nomads, and you can very quickly go from one place to the other. And so you can create, it's a perfect battleground for the creation of a warrior class. The emergence of a priestly class in India, I basically describe as the fact that you had a migration of the Hindu-speaking people who are not indigenous to the Indian subcontinent, but they moved in there, and they found themselves completely at odds with the rest of the population. But they managed to form a relationship between themselves and the rest of the population that was very hierarchical, that was very authoritarian, top-down. So you essentially had two founding populations, the Indo-European invaders and the Dravidians. And the way that was dealt with wasn't through a mercantile system of trade. It wasn't through extermination or warfare in that sense. But it was through this priest class that said, we're going to have a caste system, we're going to separate ourselves, we're going to harmonize everything. That was sort of what went down there, because ultimately there was, as people moved in, there was just this acceptance. There was no there was an initial struggle, but essentially once the Aboriginal people accepted their new rulers, there was no longer a war, there was no longer a battle to fight. And so society was not organized around the principle of constantly competing for who's at the top, because everyone knew who was at the top, because the Brahmins are at the top, and there's no contest there. They're at the top, they're always going to be at the top. And so the question was less, how do we struggle for survival? The question was less about mercantilism. And I guess I don't have an adequate explanation at this point. Why would the Middle East be more mercantile? Why would India be more priest-led? But I think it's probably due to the Indo-European heritage. But basically there was a split where most of the Indo-Europeans stayed with the warrior tradition, but those who migrated into India came up with a system that there was no need to have warriors at the top anymore. And so what the preeminent imperative was harmonizing the fact that you had two very different groups of people, the Dravidians and the Indo-Europeans, and they didn't mesh very well, but the priest class had to come along and say, okay, how can we create a society in which we can, in which everyone can get along? And you see the emergence of vegetarianism, pacifism, nonviolence, environmentalism, the sacred cow. You see all of these things emerge in India, and this pacifism emerge in India as a way to resolve conflict between all these different peoples. In the Middle East, it's not so much resolved as it's a rat race of every tribe, every clan, every individual against every other individual. Whereas again in the Indo-European steppe, it's about these warriors who are always competing for survival, always competing for dominance. And the Nordic concept is, it never ends. You die and you go to Valhalla, and again, an infinite regression in that sense. Which again, you can say is like a priestly, anything mythological inherently. When we go and we read Nordic mythology or we read Greek mythology, anytime we're looking at mythos, we are talking about a construction of the priest class. A pure warrior type doesn't create a mythos. Mythology language is the domain of the priest class. The merchant class really isn't about creating language. The merchant class is about manipulating and deceiving through language. And so the entire concept of a merchant is that you buy something at a cheaper price. You essentially say, this is worthless, and you buy it. And then you sell it to someone and say, this is priceless, and you sell it, and that's how you make a profit. And the better you can deceive people, the better you can lie to people, the more money you make as a merchant. Whereas that's not the job of a warrior per se. Now, there is an element, perhaps, in warfare of subterfuge and of feints, and there's an element of deceiving your opponent, outwitting your opponent, sure. But it's much, because it's dealing with the body, there is a straightforwardness to it, there's a truthfulness in it. And you know, the priest class, I mean, you can have a priest class which is deceptive, which is esoteric, which is inherently trying to deceive people, which is kind of the, you know, Freemasonic thing where you say, okay, well, society's Christian, but we're not. How do we sort of blend in? How do we make ourselves appear to be like everybody else, but actually secretly control everything? And then, what's the... I suppose that's all. I've really gotten off the beaten path here, really, and I knew this would happen. It happens every time. It could have been a 2-minute video. I said this could have been a 2-minute video. It could have just been me saying, look, there were fair criticisms about having kids, but the main point was that a family structure, which is really a warrior structure, a family structure is a kind of an antidote to the consumerism that people are driving toward. That's part of the capitalist system. Now, having kids in itself is not a solution, because you can have kids and treat your kids like little consumers and buy them cheap Chinese plastic toys that they play with for one day and then throw in the, you know, toy box with the millions of other toys that they have. So you can have that attitude. And I guess I've always been opposed to that. I mean, whether I look at the far left or I look at the far right, and I try to, or I even just look at people in the middle, moderate people who are pacifists, people who are, you know, more Spartan in their outlook. I look at all these different viewpoints, and I try to see things that I like in common in all of these different things. And I don't understand, I mean, it just doesn't jive with me, the idea of being okay and being complacent with the concept of cheap Chinese toys. And I suppose that for me is a kind of an like a demon. My personal demonology, if I had to say, what does a demon look like? You know, one imp, maybe an impish figure, a minor demon, would be these cheap Chinese plastic toys. They're based off this frivolous branding, this chimeral branding, this branding that comes and goes like the words in the wind and the water. It's so ephemeral, it's so meaningless, it's so yeah, and when I see people, you know there's something wrong with people when you have people in their 20s, 30s, maybe even older now, who are like attached to Pokemon, like they have Pokemon branding on their clothing. This is what we've substituted for religion, by the way. This is what we've substituted for, oh, well, you know, we can't have everyone wearing suits and ties because that's boring. So now we have a society in which people are branding themselves with Hello Kitty and Pokemon and Marvel and DC Comics and all of this invented fake stuff. And I've never liked it. I've never liked it, whether I've been looking into extreme left positions, whether I've been looking into the right wing, whether I've been looking into milquetoast, C.S. Lewis type Christianity, whatever. Every time I try to look at different systems of thought and systems of culture, I've just never appreciated, I've always had a revulsion against these little toys. And I'm sure I had some of these toys at some point, but and maybe I enjoyed playing with them. But maybe it goes to something deeper, because what's the distinction between Legos and these branded toys, Pokemon? What's the difference between Legos and an action figure or something? Legos have this infinite malleability, and they have an atomic quality to them, Legos, and I guess Minecraft is the more contemporary example, but Legos, they're something that in themselves they're sort of the simplest toy you can imagine, and you can use your imagination to build something complex. You can project your imagination onto the toy, and so there's an active participatory role that the child engages with. When the child builds up Legos, the child becomes a creator. Whereas when a child buys the Hot Wheels or whatever, it's a sort of prefabricated toy. Everything's assembled, no assembly required, it's just a toy and they play with it. That, to me, it takes away the creative, the constructive, the imaginative, and the active component. And that's something I view, then that's more of a consumer. Right now you have someone who's, they're spending money so that they can get this totally prefabricated toy that's just going to break or be thrown in the pile with the others. And I was always disgusted by that. I was always more attracted to, if you're going to have toys, be it like Lincoln Logs or Legos, and I guess today you have Minecraft, have it be something where it requires some kind of active participation. Even like, take cardboard boxes, make a fort, make a backyard fort. I mean, ultimately, I just see this shift in society because people brought it up and they said, look, you can have consumerism and children. Like, children don't solve the problem of consumerism, and I get that. But I think there is a trend, especially you look at women and the voting patterns, and I look at this refugee welcome attitude as a form of consumerism. It's a form of cat ladyism. It's a form of looking at people, trying to identify the most messed up people and pouring out resources on them. And this is how a lot of things in society are structured. And it's not people think like communism and socialism are anti-capitalist. But in my mind, they flow right together. They flow right together because following Keynes, anytime there is a tax, anytime there is a social program, it's just another broken window to stimulate growth, to stimulate economic activity. So I don't see there being any contradiction between capitalism, socialism, communism. I think they're all on a spectrum. And I guess, there's some libertarians out there who say, no, the best way to stimulate growth is if you just have no taxation at all. Okay, well, I'm just saying consumerism can exist within a socialist system. Consumerism can exist within a low-tax system. But I think that a lot of the ways that consumerism is disguised, and you look at Sweden has like a 90% tax rate. It's ridiculous. And Swedes themselves are not consumeristic in their lifestyle, perhaps, and Swedish architecture is pretty barren. It's pretty white walls and everything's simplistic. But the way that they treat these refugees is in a consumptive way. They're looking at these refugees as a problem to be solved in a way, and they sort of embrace the challenge. Right? They're looking at these refugees as infants essentially, and saying we need to bring these infants into our society, and by throwing millions of dollars at them, we can make them into perfect Swedes. We can make them even more superior to the original Swedes. So there's something consumptive about this, about trying to take fundamentally messed up people. And it might not be their fault. I'm not even blaming the people. They might come from a war-torn society. They might come from a broken society. And legitimately, I'm not even saying that it's their fault for being uneducated, for having higher rates of criminality, higher rates of this and that. I'm not even saying that, but what I'm saying is there's this urge to take people who are broken. There's this this highlighting of brokenness, which is interesting because you look at Christianity as like the ultimate mother morality, the ultimate in feeding the poor, putting the poor before the rich. The meek shall inherit the earth. It's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to pass through a needle. All this stuff, and yet you look at Christ himself, and Christ wasn't interested in the Samaritan woman until she totally humbled herself. Right? She just had to say, I'm like a dog. And so Christ said, okay, yeah, I'll help you out. But it wasn't like Christ was going up to screaming Black Lives Matter protesters and being like, I know you hate me because I'm not black, but here's all the money in social programs, and yeah, I deserve all this because of my white privilege. So there is a distinction there, and of course the tale where there's the choice between spending the money on the perfume and spending the money on the poor, and Christ says, spend the money on the perfume and pour the perfume out at me, because you're always going to have the poor. And that's true. There are always going to be people, no matter how perfect your system is, there are always going to be people who are dysfunctional. Because it's always, entropy is always easier than order. It's always easier to knock down a sandcastle than to build it up. And the human mind is very complex, and it's always easier to mess people up than to build them up. It's always easier to, again, through whether it's environmental plastics, pesticides, antidepressants in the water supply, or whether it's just, you know, the natural UV from the sun causing random genetic mutations. Disease happens, and you have people who are cognitively incapable, and you have then this drive for consumption, this motherly consumption that wants to pour, you know, 90% of education spending into focusing on the worst cases, focusing on the most incapable students, and the ones who are capable, you want to shame those students, you want to drag them down to the level of the least capable, and you want to force them to be bullied. You want to overwhelm them, you want to have mass immigration, you want to make them minorities in their own countries. So there is something consumptive about this, and it is in line with capitalism. So I was trying to unite all these things. I don't think I have much else to say. Maybe it's just an opening to the conversation, bounced around on a lot of concepts. Nothing too firm today. Not a, you know, where it's kind of a dynamic, I think, between I'm trying to do really concise, like really packed full of stuff, like 10-minute long videos that you watch a 10-minute long video and it's like, okay, there's something substantive here, there's something I can sink my teeth into, there's actual information that I can grasp onto, okay, this is a claim that's being made, is there a counterclaim, you know, what's going on here? So I'm trying to do some of that, but then we're still having the long-winded circumlocution where I just go on a ramble about 20 different topics, and there's no resolution at the end, but life goes on. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.